A stone hut. Empty. There's over 1,400 of these scattered across St Kilda. Cleitian, the islanders called them. Little dry stone chambers built into the hillside, vented and turf-roofed, meant to dry out seabird carcasses, peat, grain, whatever needed keeping. Most are still standing. None of them have a name attached to who built them. Here's a name that did survive. Rachel Gillies. Born in St Kilda. Died in 2016 at 93. The last person alive who could say that. 2 countries ran her obituary. The island sits about 64 kilometers off Scotland. Most remote inhabited point in the British Isles for most of its history. Cliffs among the highest in Britain. Seabird colonies among the largest in Europe. No real soil to speak of. No reliable way to get supplies in once the weather turned. People built a working settlement there anyway, and lived in it for something like 4,000 years. No written language, no royal records, nothing like a war chronicle, nothing close. What carried instead was the stone, and a kind of knowledge passed hand to hand, climber to climber, for 2,000 years before anyone outside the island bothered writing a word of it down. In 1930, the last 36 people on St Kilda asked the British government to take them off. Rachel was 8. She got on a ship called the Harebell and left the only home she'd ever known. How does the best documented person in St Kilda's whole history turn out to be the one who left? We can name maybe 100 people from before 1930, out of 4,000 years. Rachel Gillies has a death certificate, and most of St Kilda has a cleit. That's the part that gets me, honestly. Not that the people are forgotten, that the buildings outlasted the memory of them just by being made of the wrong material to carry a signature. One woman who left the island as a child ended up more documented than 4,000 years of people who never left at all. You're standing on the jetty at Village Bay. May 1930. The wind doing what it always does out here, cutting straight through wool, through stone, through whatever you've got on. 3 weeks ago, you signed a petition. Your name's probably one of the 20 on it. Not that it matters much now. This spring, the island finally stopped being able to feed itself, after a long stretch of barely managing it. There's a reason almost nobody who lived here before you ever got that same chance to ask, to sign anything at all. Your sister died in January. The men who used to climb for seabird eggs and oil, they've been peeling off for the mainland for about a decade, one family at a time. At some point, that just becomes a math problem. Not enough hands left for a winter's harvest. That's it. That's the whole crisis. Dressed up as something simpler. A few sheep. Some cleitians stocked with last year's salted seabirds. A cottage your family's lived in for 4 generations, maybe more. Nobody can say exactly, since nobody ever wrote the date on the door. You're not choosing to leave St Kilda so much as running out of people to stay with it. The street behind you curves the way it has since the 1830s, when they rebuilt the houses, stone over the older black houses, same footprint. Most of what you own fits in a trunk. The rest stays because there's no boat big enough for a house, and you'd never even thought about that until now. Your grandmother climbed cliffs most mainland men wouldn't look at twice. Your father could read a storm 2 hours out just from the color of the water. He knew the safe routes up Connacher in a south wind and the ones that had already killed a man back in his own father's time. None of that's in any book. It never needed to be until now, when there's no one left to teach it to. None of that goes anywhere once the door locks for good. No apprentice on the mainland waiting to inherit it. There just isn't one. This whole story turns on something, and it's not really isolation, whatever the postcards say later. It's what gets written down. Watch the government inventory crew that's about to walk through this cottage. They'll count the sheep, the trunks, the bodies leaving on the boat. What they will not ask is how your grandmother learned the cliffs, because that's not the kind of thing anyone's ever needed written down before. A record gets kept when somebody in charge needs it, for their own reasons, full stop. Not because life mattered. St Kilda was a sheep run, then a church outpost, then a tourist attraction, then a government file, then finally an evacuation order. Each one of those wrote down exactly what it needed, nothing more. 2,000 years of people came before any of that ever showed up, and what they left behind is Cleitian, cliff paths, and not much else. Nobody's coming to write any of this down except the one time it stops being a community and starts being a logistics problem. That's the moment the cameras and the clerks show up, not before. The first time anyone outside St Kilda wrote its name down was the late 1300s. One sentence from a chronicler describing the Isle of Erte as a place on the margins of the world. That's the entire record, covering an island that had already been lived on for something like 3,000 years by then. Archaeology fills in a little of it, not much. Bronze Age tool fragments. Iron Age ones too. Older foundations under the village street you can still walk on today. The Cleitian themselves are different ages, some clearly older, stacked into the hillside almost like geology. None of it carries a name because stone doesn't sign itself. And the first humans who showed up and wrote about the place left a different kind of silence. One you can trace back to a reason. The first real eyewitness account. A churchman, Donald Munro, came and wrote home about it, calling the islanders simple, poor, barely versed in religion. A steward and a chaplain visited once a year, midsummer, collected rents, baptized whatever kids had shown up since the last trip. And then his account just sat there. Munro's manuscript wasn't published until 1582 and didn't reach anyone outside a small circle of readers until 1774, more than 200 years after he wrote it. The record existed the whole time. It just didn't function as one. Because that's what Munro was there for. Not to get to know anybody. To do the books. The MacLeods owned the island and needed rents counted, souls accounted for. That's the whole job. And so that's the whole record. Not one islander's name made it in. Though that's not really on Munro, when I think about it. Nobody sent him there to write a biography of anyone. He did the job he was given. Compare that to Rachel Gillies, whose name survives because the government writing it down by 1930, was a modern bureau processing and evacuation. Monroe's outfit needed something much smaller back in 1549. Confirmation rents got paid. Confirmation babies got christened. Whoever's keeping the record only ever writes down what they actually need. There's a smaller version of this same thing buried in Martin Martin's account from 1697. He describes a ruined shealing hut the islanders called Taig na Banaghais Gaish, the warrior woman's house, and mentions, almost in passing, that the islanders had a lot of stories about whoever she was. Then he moves straight on to the spring water nearby, like it's the more interesting fact. Not one of those stories makes it onto the page. I don't think he even noticed what he was leaving out. A guy with a pen in his actual hand standing next to people who could have given him a name, a whole history, an oral tradition going back who knows how far, and he picks the well instead. All that's left of her now is a place name and the fact that stories about her used to exist. The islanders knew them. He just didn't think they were worth the ink. August 1727. A fowling party leaves Hirta for Stack and Armin, a sea stack out in the Atlantic where seabirds nest by the thousand. 3 men, 8 boys. Simple plan: drop them on the stack, let them work, come back in a fortnight, bring them home. They don't come back in a fortnight. A boat returns from Harris carrying the belongings of a man named Donald MacDonald, a relative of someone on the island who'd died over there of what got recorded as smallpox. 2 weeks. That's all it takes. The disease tears through Hirta, and the accounts that survive describe barely enough adults left standing to bury the dead. 94, one account says. 1 adult and 18 kids left alive on the main island by the time it's over. The 11 on the Stas know none of this. They're sitting on a rock in the Atlantic, rationing gannet meat. Days pass. No boat. More days. When it finally shows up, way later than planned, what they find instead of their community is a village of survivors. Empty houses. A quiet that isn't normal. Isolation, the thing everyone says defined this place, is exactly what saves them this time. The sea that cut them off from everything else cuts them off from the outbreak too. And for once, that's why 11 specific people are still breathing. 94 people died in 2 weeks, and almost none of them have a name. We know roughly how many died, not most of their names, because the death toll only mattered to whoever needed a population count to justify bringing new families over from Harris. Nobody holding a pen in 1727 needed 94 specific names. They needed a number, one that explained a labor shortage. 203 years later, one more death on that same island gets the opposite treatment. Rachel Gillies' own sister, Mary, died in 1930, only weeks before the evacuation, sick enough that they had to carry her off the island for treatment she couldn't get at home. Mary's death has a name attached, an age, a cause. Because a death on St Kilda in 1930 kicked off paperwork that simply didn't exist 2 centuries earlier. Medical paperwork, government paperwork. Eventually, even the newspapers picked it up. The 94 people who died back in 1727 got none of that, not one scrap. Rachel outlived her sister by 86 years. She's the only name from that whole household the wider world ever bothered holding onto. The men who came later with pens instead of plagues weren't any better about leaving names behind. Different excuses, same outcome. A traveller from Skye named Martin wrote the most detailed account of St Kilda anyone would produce before the 1800s, back in 1697. Across the whole thing, only a handful of islanders get named. Almost always men who held some kind of position. Parish registers for the island only start once a missionary actually moves there, early 1700s, which is more than 2,000 years into people living on the island. That register is the first document anyone ever built to put names down, person by person. It exists because the church needed it for their own bookkeeping. Full stop, no other reason. The moment that need showed up, names started surviving. Before it, they didn't. By the 1880s, steamships were bringing paying tourists to St Kilda for the first time. The SS Dunara Castle runs summer cruises advertised as Lone St Kilda. They are, quite literally, selling the isolation as the whole point. One visitor in 1900 says, flat out, "It felt like watching animals in a zoo." The tourists brought disease too, and nobody put that on a postcard. Infant mortality on St Kilda climbed sharply in those same decades. Likely cause: neonatal tetanus, introduced through outside contact, with death rates among newborns reported as high as 80% some years. That number survives, well documented, because public health officials eventually need to explain it. The infants themselves don't survive in any record at all. There's one name from this era that does survive, and the way it survives proves the same point from a different angle. In 1877, a journalist named John Sands got stranded on the island with 9 shipwrecked Austrian sailors. No way to call for help. He sealed a message inside something buoyant. It washed up on Orkney 9 days later, and a rescue boat got sent. It worked, so the islanders kept doing it, turning it into their own postal system. In 1885, a 14-year-old named Alexander Gillies launched several after a storm wrecked the island's food supply, and one reached Lewis. Money and a relief boat followed. Alexander Gillies has a name in the record today, for the same reason any of them ever do. The invention got written about once by the man who needed to explain where the idea came from. Most of the other kids who grew up right next to him, who sent their own letters out on their own boats for decades after, faced the same storms and the same shortages. They left nothing behind. The boat survived as a method. The names on it never did. What survives instead, in massive quantities, is physical stone, not paper. Over 1,400 cleitien across the islands, most clustered on Hirta. Dozens more out on the sea stacks, where fowling parties camped for weeks at a stretch. Each one built the same careful way, refined over generations. Dry stone walls with gaps for the wind. A turf roof to keep rain out while air still moved underneath. no mortar, because that would have blocked the airflow the design depended on. Seabird carcasses stored in there, eggs packed in peat ash, fish, wool, grain, turf for fuel. None of it needing salt or smoke, because the wind did that job for free. The sizes vary, some big enough to duck into, others barely large enough to crawl in and reach an arm back out. Different builders, probably different decades, solving the same problem the same way without ever writing it down. The population on the island never topped 200 people, even at its peak. They built more storage huts than they had neighbors, and they kept every single one of them in repair. The seabird economy this system supported was massive. Men climbed some of the highest cliffs in Britain for gannets, fulmars, puffins by the thousand every season, with basically nothing but a rope between them and a long fall. None of them left a written account of how they learned the climb. Who taught them? Which routes were actually safe, generation after generation, on cliffs among the deadliest in Britain? That knowledge just passed, climber to climber, with no document anywhere. Stone doesn't need anybody's permission to last. Names did. There's a whole system of self-government buried in the same silence. Every morning, the adult men of St Kilda met in the open street right after prayers and worked out the day together. No one chaired it. No vote, no minutes, no single guy running things. Anyone could speak. They just figured it out. Who fishes, who climbs, who tends the animals that day. Visitors who saw it called it a parliament, and that's about right. A group of people who'd been running their own community for centuries with no rulebook anywhere, no member list, nothing. Martin himself, in 1697, said the islanders seemed happier than most people he'd ever come across, saying they had a kind of liberty he rarely saw anywhere else. He wrote that part down. What he never wrote down was who actually spoke at those meetings, whose argument won, how a dispute even got settled before everyone walked back out to start the day's work. A system that ran every single day for generations, and somehow left less paper behind than one afternoon in 1930. One exception, and it confirms the rule more than it breaks it. Between roughly 1734 and 1742, a kidnapped Edinburgh noblewoman lived in exile on Hirta. History knows her as Lady Grange. Her husband had her sent there because she'd threatened to expose his Jacobite sympathies. She wrote letters describing her own abduction, smuggled them off the island, and those letters still sit in a university archive today. Lady Grange has a Wikipedia page, a biography. There's even a stone ruin on Hirta still known by her name. None of that came from St Kilda deciding she mattered. It came from Edinburgh. From a husband with powerful enemies, from lawyers and politicians who needed her story documented to settle scores that had nothing to do with the island she'd been dumped on. The people who fed her, sheltered her, lived alongside her for 8 years, almost none of them have a name anywhere in the record her own case produced. She got one because the mainland needed it. They didn't, because nobody outside the island ever needed theirs. Multiply that across 4,000 years, and it's almost too much to hold in your head. A mother naming a kid born on some cliffside croft in a year nobody outside the island will ever know existed. A boy learning one rope length at a time, which handholds on Conacher would kill him. Some grazing dispute argued out in the morning parliament, settled, never mentioned again. None of it left a trace any archive could file. Didn't mean it mattered less, just because nobody with a reason to write it down ever happened to be standing there. Rachel Gillies grew up inside exactly that kind of unrecorded life, right up until the year it suddenly wasn't unrecorded anymore. And something is still standing on that hillside today that nobody's ever fully figured out. Walk the hillside on Hirta today, and every cleit has a small metal tag on it now. A survey number stamped into the stone decades back by an archaeologist who never met whoever stacked it. Kind of a strange swap when you think about it. We replaced the builder's name with somebody else's filing system. The tag tells you the cluster, roughly the date, but nothing about whose hands did the work. A plaque and a press release came with it eventually. UNESCO World Heritage Site, 1986. The National Trust for Scotland had already taken over running the place back in 1957. Every summer since, crews go out and physically rebuild the collapsed cleitian, stone by stone, using the same dry stone method the original builders used. That method survived just fine. Got passed down through surveys, through hands-on training, through whoever showed up wanting to learn it. The builders themselves? Gone. Not one name made it through. In 2011, archaeologists found something new on Borroway, one of the smaller islands in the group. Settlement mounds, field systems. Evidence that people actually farmed out there, maybe back in prehistory, centuries before anyone thought to look. It's the kind of find that gets a headline about a lost community. It still doesn't get anyone a name. 1830 is as far back as the official parish registers go, which leaves less than 100 years before the whole thing got shut down for good. Everything before that date is reconstruction. Calling it research is generous. Most of it is guesswork, built on whatever scraps happened to survive. One man tried harder than that, though. A Hebridean genealogist, Bill Lawson, spent decades trying to work out which families repopulated the island after the 1727 epidemic. Surname patterns, oral history through descendants of Harris, scraps of old estate paperwork. He learned Gaelic specifically because the work required it, since most of what he needed was sitting in the memories of old people who were dying off faster than he could write it down. That's a hell of a way to spend a career, honestly, chasing 90 names through somebody else's family stories. He eventually put together a list of roughly 90 people, sorted into 19 households, names like Morrison, MacDonald, Gillies among them. 90 names. That's the entire haul after most of a working lifetime. The only real attempt anyone's ever made to put names back on St Kilda's pre-1830 population. 2,000 years of islanders came before those 90, and almost none of them are ever getting a name back. The record was missing a name in 1549, and it's still missing most of them. That cleit is still empty. Was empty when this video opened? Been empty since 1930? Unidentified since whenever it was actually built? which could be 400 years ago, could be 40. Nobody alive knows, and nobody alive can ask the person who actually did it. So the question this whole thing opened with: how does the best documented person in St Kilda's history end up being the one who left? Turns out it was never really about importance. Documentation shows up the second somebody with the power to keep records needs a name. Not 1 second before that. Walk into pretty much any Hebridean parish church, and the written record kicks off the year a minister moved in, not the year the first person was born there. Same thing at any dig site, where the stonework outlives the hands that built it by centuries and doesn't say a word about who they were. There's a box in the National Records of Scotland right now with a rent roll from the 1700s in it. Somewhere, a researcher is holding a magnifying glass over a name in a parish register from a different decade, trying to see if the two match. Most of the time, they don't. The 1930 evacuation files are thick with names because a government bureau processing a resettlement needed names. A minister visiting once a year in 1727 never did. 4,000 years of people lived and died on that hillside. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, photographed and listed down to the last detail. And almost everyone who actually lived there remains completely nameless. Thousands of names stacked across 40 centuries, sitting behind a single one that happened to leave the island at the right moment in history to get written down. Fewer than 100 people we can name, out of 4,000 years of them. One death certificate that the world actually bothered to keep. Rachel Gillies has a death certificate. Most of St Kilda doesn't.